Greetings, road warriors. Tonight our chronicle covers not just a machine, but a rolling piece of the American dream. We're tracing the complete story of the Peterbilt 389. Picture it, that unmistakable silhouette against a fading twilight sky. The long square hood stretching out like a declaration of intent. The twin stacks cutting vertical lines against the horizontal blur of the landscape, and that cascade of amber clearance lights reflecting softly on wet pavement. It's a shape that means business, a shape that means home for the men and women behind the wheel. Let's be honest, there are few things in this industry that feel quite as good as catching the reflection of your own perfectly polished rig in the window of a building as you roll past. It's a quiet nod of approval from the world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm curious to see where everyone is settling in from tonight. Drop your location and maybe your local time in the comments below, just to see how far this convoy stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story doesn't begin on a clean, modern assembly line. It starts in the mud. It begins in the dense, damp forests of the Pacific Northwest, with a man who had a serious problem. The man was Theodore Alfred Peterman, a plywood manufacturer and logger based in Tacoma, Washington. In the 1930s, the accepted way to get massive ancient logs out of the brutal backcountry was either by floating them down rivers or hauling them with steam-powered tractors. Both methods were slow, inefficient, and incredibly dangerous. Peterman, being a practical and driven businessman, saw a better way. He had watched the rise of the motor truck and believed it was the future, but the trucks of the day simply weren't built for the sheer abuse of Northwest logging. They were underpowered, their frames were weak, and the logging roads, if you could even call them roads, ate them for breakfast. Peterman began by acquiring and modifying surplus military trucks, strengthening their frames and adapting them for the specific, violent task of hauling timber. He was a tinkerer, a problem solver. He wasn't trying to start a truck company, he was just trying to get his trees to the mill. But his modified trucks worked. They worked so well that other loggers started to notice. The demand grew, and Peterman's vision expanded. He wasn't just fixing old trucks anymore, he was designing new ones. His key historical opportunity came in 1938. The Fagel Motors Company of Oakland, California, a well-respected but financially struggling bus and truck manufacturer, had fallen into receivership. Peterman saw his chance. In 1939, he purchased the Fagel assets, secured the 13.5-acre factory, and Peterbilt Motors Company was officially born. The name itself was a blend of his own and a nod to the "Bilt" suffix, which at the time was synonymous with quality, thanks to brands like Vanderbilt. It was a statement of quality from day one. The very first trucks to roll out of that Oakland facility were not the long-hooded icons we imagine. They were rugged, purposeful tools. The Model 260 was a chain-drive powerhouse, designed specifically for the grunt work of logging. Now, for those who came up in the era of modern differentials, a chain drive is a fascinating technical detail. Instead of a solid drive shaft and differential turning the axles, the 260 had a differential mounted solidly to the frame, which then sent power to the rear wheels via a pair of massive exposed roller chains, much like on an enormous bicycle. This design gave it incredible gear reduction, perfect for low-speed pulling, and massive ground clearance, as there was no pumpkin hanging down to get snagged on stumps or rocks. It was archaic, noisy, and messy, but in the Washington mud, it was effective. Alongside it was the Model 334, a more conventional shaft-drive truck, which quickly found buyers in the general freight and construction industries. From the very beginning, Peterbilt established a philosophy that would define it for the next century: custom building. They didn't operate on a rigid assembly line, they built trucks to order. A customer could walk in and specify the engine, the transmission, the axle ratios, and the frame length. This custom-built approach made Peterbilt trucks more expensive, but it also made them tougher and more precisely suited to the job. This philosophy was a direct reflection of T.A. Peterman himself. He was the customer. He knew the frustration of using a tool that wasn't quite right. His human element, his experience as an end user, was baked into the company's DNA. He famously roamed the factory floor talking with the engineers and assemblers, insisting on quality over speed. He was known for his motto, "Fit and finish." It wasn't just a truck, it was a Peterbilt. Tragically, Theodore Peterman would not live to see the true legacy he had created. He died of cancer in 1944, just 5 years after founding the company. His wife, Ida, sold the company to a group of 7 company managers who kept the focus on custom-built heavy-duty trucks. The post-war years were a boom time. The American highway system was beginning to connect the coasts, and the demand for long-haul trucking exploded. This era gave us the narrow nose or iron nose Model 351, which debuted in 1954. This truck is the true ancestor of the 389. It established the classic conventional layout that would become Peterbilt's signature. The long hood, the set-back front axle for a better ride and tighter turning, and the commanding driver position. It was also the first model to feature the iconic bird hood ornament, perched proudly at the front aiming for the horizon. The 351 was durable, it was reliable, and drivers loved it. It was the truck that proved Peterbilt wasn't just a niche West Coast builder, it was a national contender. But the company faced another crisis. By the mid-1950s, the managing partners were looking to retire, and they needed a buyer who would protect the brand's identity. In 1958, Pacific Car and Foundry, or PACCAR, a successful Seattle-based manufacturer of railway cars and heavy-duty winches, acquired Peterbilt. This was the single most important moment in the company's modern history. PACCAR had deep pockets and a hands-off management style. They provided the capital and stability Peterbilt needed to grow, innovate, and, crucially, to keep being Peterbilt. With PACCAR's backing, the 351 continued its reign. But drivers in the 1960s were changing. The interstate highway system, kicked off by President Eisenhower in 1956, was stretching across the continent. Long-haul trips were becoming faster and more common. Drivers were spending more time in their cabs than ever before, and they started wanting more than just a tool. They wanted comfort, they wanted style, they wanted power. Peterbilt's engineers, now securely funded, began working on a successor to the venerable 351. They knew they had to keep the durability, but they also needed to create something that would turn heads at the truck stop. They needed to design a truck that a driver wouldn't just operate but would be proud to own. They were on the verge of creating the first true class truck, a machine that would blend workhorse utility with automotive elegance. The result would be a truck so successful, so perfectly timed, that it would earn a nickname that is still spoken with reverence today. They were about to create the Needle Nose King. The engineers at Peterbilt's Oakland plant understood the assignment. The post-war boom was over, the 1960s were in full swing, and the highways were calling for something more. They weren't just building a tool, they were crafting an image. In 1967, they pulled the cover off their creation, and the trucking world was changed forever. It was the Peterbilt Model 359. And it was, in a word, magnificent. It took the strong bones of the 351 and wrapped them in a suit of undeniable class. The 359 was the truck that established the long hood conventional as the undisputed king of the American highway. That long, squared-off hood, which would earn it the affectionate nickname Needle Nose, was a declaration of power. It wasn't just a design choice, it was a functional necessity that became a legendary aesthetic. The massive diesel engines of the era, the big cam Cummins and the mighty Caterpillars, were getting more powerful, but they were also getting larger. They needed room to breathe, and they needed room for radiators big enough to keep them cool while pulling 80,000 pounds up a mountain grade. The 359's expansive engine bay provided that room, and in doing so created a profile that screamed power. This design was a direct response to the new arteries of the nation. The key historical fact of this era was the explosive growth of the interstate highway system. Signed into law in 1956, the 1960s saw this massive public works project truly come to life, paving over 40,000 miles of high-speed limited-access roadway. The 359 was arguably the first truck built to conquer this new environment. It was designed for 70-mile-per-hour cruising, for non-stop runs from Chicago to Los Angeles. The setback front axle from the 351 was perfected, shifting more weight to the front, which allowed for heavier payloads on the drives, but more importantly it gave the 359 a Cadillac smooth ride on the new, pristine asphalt. But the 359's most revolutionary feature wasn't its hood length or its ride. It was something that made every mechanic and owner-operator who ever worked on one want to kiss the engineers. The 359 featured a lightweight fiberglass hood that, with one simple latch, tilted forward a full 90 degrees. This is the technical detail that changed the game. Before this, working on an engine was a chiropractor's nightmare. Mechanics had to deal with heavy, butterfly hoods that opened from the side, forcing them to lean over hot fenders or small access panels that offered a frustrating porthole view of the problem. The 359's tilt hood, by contrast, opened up the entire engine bay. Suddenly, a mechanic could stand right next to the engine, with easy access to the turbo, the fuel pump, the belts, everything. It was a revolution in serviceability. Finally, a mechanic could tear down a top end without performing advanced yoga poses just to reach a back bolt. This one feature saved countless hours of labour, countless skinned knuckles, and probably countless dollars in swear jars. This ease of maintenance was a critical factor in the 359's appeal to a new, powerful force in the industry, the independent owner-operator. And here lies the human element of the 359's story. This truck became the symbol of the American independent trucker. In the regulated era of trucking before 1980, the owner-operator was a unique breed. They were entrepreneurs. They owned their rig, they often found their own loads, and they lived and died by their truck's reliability. The 359 was their perfect partner. It was reliable, it was easy to work on themselves, and crucially, it held its value better than any other truck on the market. But more than that, it was a rolling testament to their pride. The 359 was a blank canvas. Peterbilt offered an unprecedented level of customization from the factory. You could spec your engine, your transmission. The 13 and 18 speeds were legends in themselves, your axle ratios, and your paint. Oh, the paint. Peterbilt's paint jobs were automotive quality, with deep metallic flakes and intricate two-tone or pinstripe schemes. Owner-operators would then take this canvas and turn it into a masterpiece. They added chrome. So much chrome. Polished stacks, chrome-plated grille bars, mirror-shined aluminum wheels, stainless steel chicken-light panels, and rows of amber lights that made the truck glow like a cathedral on wheels. Drivers would spend their downtime at truck stops with a rag and a jar of polishing compound, tirelessly shining the fuel tanks and battery boxes until they looked like liquid mercury. It was a running joke that many veteran drivers developed chrome elbow from decades of polishing, a painful but proud affliction. This wasn't just vanity, it was a business card. A clean, shining, customized 359 told the world, and more importantly the shipping docks, that this was a professional. This was someone who took their job and their equipment seriously. This was a driver who cared. The view from the driver's seat was just as iconic. The 359 featured a large two-piece flat glass windshield. This was practical. A flat pane is cheaper to replace than a curved one when a rock inevitably finds it, but it also created a unique, panoramic view of the road. Staring out over that long needle-nose hood, with the chrome bird ornament leading the way, gave the driver a feeling of command, of piloting something substantial. The dash was a classic flat panel design, a beautiful expanse of gauges with metal bezels, giving the driver constant analog feedback on oil pressure, water temperature, boost, and pyrometers. There was no computer. The driver was the computer, reading the gauges, listening to the hum of the engine, and feeling the road through the wheel. The 359 reigned for 20 years, from 1967 to 1987. During that time, it saw recessions, fuel crises, and the radical deregulation of the trucking industry in 1980. And through it all, it just kept selling. It became the benchmark. Other companies built trucks. Peterbilt, it was said, built the 359. But as the 1980s progressed, the world was changing again. Aerodynamics, a word that was almost laughable when applied to the 359's brick-like profile, was suddenly becoming important. Fuel economy was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity. And while drivers loved the classic looks, they were starting to want more interior room, more comfort, and a quieter ride. The 359, with its legendary status, was also becoming a victim of its own 1960s design. Peterbilt's engineers were faced with an impossible task. How do you replace a legend? How do you create a truck that satisfies the demands of a new, efficiency-focused era without alienating the thousands of loyal drivers who believed the 359 was the last real truck? They knew their next model couldn't just be an update. It had to be a worthy successor. It had to carry the torch, while also carving its own path. They were about to take the timeless DNA of the needle nose and evolve it into the truck that would define the modern era. The challenge was monumental. Replacing the 359 was like trying to repaint the Mona Lisa. The loyalists were skeptical, and competitors were watching. Peterbilt's engineers knew that if they strayed too far, they'd be accused of heresy. If they didn't change enough, the truck would be obsolete before it hit the highway. So in 1987, they unveiled their solution, the Peterbilt Model 379. At first glance, the trucking world breathed a collective, if tentative, sigh of relief. It looked right. The long, needle-nose hood was still there, proud and defiant. The classic grille, the bird ornament, the cab-mounted air cleaners. The essential DNA was intact. This was a key historical decision. Peterbilt chose evolution, not revolution. They understood that the 379's first job was to reassure the 359's faithful followers that the king had not been dethroned, merely given a new set of clothes. But while the silhouette was familiar, the substance was new. The most significant upgrade, and the technical detail that truly defined the 379, was the cab itself. The 359's cab was a product of the 1960s, strong but by 1980 standards, a bit cramped. The new 379 cab was wider, it was taller, offering significantly more headroom. The doors were larger, the windows were bigger, and the entire structure was built with better sound and thermal insulation. It was, quite simply, a more civilized place to spend 1,000,000 miles. Crucially, Peterbilt kept the 359's most iconic feature, the two-piece flat glass windshield. In an era where other manufacturers were moving to curved aerodynamic glass, this was a powerful statement. It was a direct nod to heritage, a visual promise that this was still a traditional truck, and on a practical level, drivers loved it. When a rock inevitably cracked the windshield on a desolate stretch of I-80, replacing a single flat pane was infinitely cheaper, and easier than finding a curved one. Under the skin, the changes continued. The long hood, while visually similar, was now made of aluminum instead of the 359's fiberglass. This made it significantly lighter, reducing front axle weight, a constant battle for drivers, and making it far easier to tilt for service. But the real revolution came in 1994, with the introduction of the Unibilt cab and sleeper system. This was the feature that changed long-haul life. Before the Unibilt, a sleeper was a separate box bolted to the back of the cab. The connection was a rubber boot, a small accordion-like tunnel. This boot was notoriously drafty, noisy, and cramped. It was less a pass-through and more a pass draft, and was probably home to at least 3 missing pens and a rogue French fry. The Unibilt system, by contrast, was a single integrated shell. The cab and sleeper were one solid piece. Drivers could now stand up and walk directly from the driver's seat into their living quarters without contorting themselves. It was quieter, it was sealed from the elements, and it was vastly more spacious. Peterbilt offered massive sleeper options, 63-inch, 70-inch, that were less bunks and more rolling studio apartments. This combination of classic looks and modern comfort made the 379 the undisputed champion of the owner-operator. It was the truck you bought with your own money, the truck you polished on Saturday, the truck that was your home, your office, and your business card. And this is where the human element of the 379 transcends the highway and drives straight into pop culture. The 379 didn't just haul freight, it hauled an image. It debuted in the late 80s, the era of bigger is better, and it was the biggest, baddest rig on the road. Hollywood fell in love. If a movie needed to portray the quintessential American trucker, tough, independent, the king of the road, they didn't cast an actor. They cast a 379. Its filmography is legendary. It was the menacing, unseen villain Rusty Nail in the 2001 thriller Joyride. It was the hero's rig in the 1998 Patrick Swayze film Black Dog. But its most famous role, the one that cemented it in the minds of an entire generation, came in 2007. The key historical fact of its stardom is this. Optimus Prime, the noble leader of the Autobots in Michael Bay's Transformers, was a 1994 Peterbilt 379. Suddenly, every kid in America knew what a 379 was, even if they thought it could fold itself into a 30-foot-tall robot. which, to be fair, is not a standard factory option. This role transformed the 379 from a piece of industrial equipment into a global icon, a symbol of American strength and nobility. This media saturation created a powerful feedback loop. Owner-operators wanted the Optimus Prime truck. It was the truck their kids pointed at. It was the truck that made them feel like the hero of their own movie every time they turned the key. The 379 had an incredible 20-year run, from 1987 to 2007, a reign that perfectly matched its 359 predecessor. It served as the bridge from the analog past to the digital future. The earliest 379s left the factory with fully mechanical engines, like the legendary Caterpillar 3406B, an engine that drivers loved because they could tune it with a wrench and a good ear. By the end of its run, the 379 was powered by fully electronic engines like the Cat C15 and the Cummins ISX. This transition made many old-school drivers nervous. They'd tap the new digital dashboard displays as if trying to magically find a loose wire, muttering about black boxes and sensors. But the 379's traditional shell made the new technology easier to swallow. It might have had a computer, but it felt like a real truck. But just like its father, the 379's time was running out. The winds of change were blowing, and this time they were coming from Washington, D.C. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, had mandated a new, incredibly strict set of emission standards for diesel engines set to take effect in 2007. These new engines would run hotter, require massive new exhaust after-treatment systems like diesel particulate filters or DPFs, and demand far more cooling. The 379's 1980s era design, for all its beauty, was an aerodynamic and cooling nightmare. That flat two-piece windshield was like hitting a wall of air. The cab-mounted air cleaners, while looking fantastic, created massive drag. The grille opening was struggling to feed enough air to the new, hotter engines. Peterbilt's engineers were back at the same impossible crossroads. They had to replace a legend again. Only this time, the legend was the 379, the most popular and recognisable truck on Earth. And they had to do it while meeting government regulations that seemed designed to kill the very idea of a classic long-hood truck. The challenge was immense. Build a truck that could satisfy the EPA, the fleet accountants demanding fuel economy, and the owner-operator who just wanted a 379. The pressure was immense, and it wasn't just coming from the turbochargers. The engineers at Peterbilt's headquarters in Denton, Texas, where the company had moved in 1980, were staring down an engineering challenge that felt almost like a betrayal. They were being forced, by law, to kill the king. The key historical fact that changed everything was the 2007 EPA emissions mandate. This wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a non-negotiable, industry-shattering directive. It called for a 90% reduction in particulate matter, that's the black soot you'd see puffing from stacks on a hard pull, and a 50% reduction in nitrogen oxides, or NOx. To achieve this, engine manufacturers had to adopt two new complex and unproven technologies: diesel particulate filters, DPFs, and enhanced exhaust gas recirculation, EGR. And these two systems, while cleaning the air, declared war on the classic design of the Peterbilt 379. Let's break down the problem. First, EGR. This system takes a portion of the engine's exhaust gas and pipes it back into the cylinders. This process lowers combustion temperatures, which reduces NOx. The problem? You're forcing the engine to breathe hot, dirty air. This makes the entire system run hotter, much hotter. Second, the DPF. This is, essentially, a massive, complex filter in the exhaust system designed to trap soot. Once it gets full, it has to clean itself in a process called regeneration, where it uses fuel to heat itself up to over 1000 degrees Fahrenheit, incinerating the soot into a fine ash. So now you have an engine running hotter from EGR, and a 200-pound superheating canister in the exhaust. The 379 was completely, fundamentally unequipped to handle this. And this brings us to the core technical detail of the challenge: cooling. All that extra heat from the EGR and the DPF's regeneration cycles had to go somewhere. The new engines, like the Caterpillar C15 Acert and the Cummins ISX, needed a radiator of unprecedented size. The 379, with its beautiful classic needle-nose grille opening, simply couldn't flow enough air. Its grille was designed in an era of cooler-running, less complex engines. To make a 2007 spec engine survive, Peterbilt's engineers needed to dramatically increase the cooling package, the radiator, the charge air cooler, and the fan. The 379's face, the very thing that made it a 379, wasn't big enough. But the problems didn't stop there. The 379 was an aerodynamic brick, that majestic, flat two-piece windshield that drivers loved. It was about as slippery as a parachute. Those iconic cab-mounted air cleaners, they looked incredible, but from an aerodynamic perspective, they were like dragging two open buckets down the highway. With fuel prices in the mid-2000s beginning their dizzying climb, fleet owners were screaming for fuel economy. The 379, a child of the 80s, was thirsty, and its design was the reason. So, the engineers were trapped. They were in a crossfire between three opposing forces. The EPA demanded clean air, which meant hot, bulky, heavy new equipment. The fleet owners demanded fuel economy, which meant a slippery, lightweight, aerodynamic design. And then there was the most powerful, most emotional stakeholder of all, the owner-operator. This human element was the real tightrope, the independent driver, the 379 loyalist. They didn't care about drag coefficients or EGR percentages. They cared about heritage. They cared about the long hood. They cared about the flat windshield and the dual air cleaners. They cared about the image. They had spent 20 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars turning the 379 into a rolling identity. And now, these engineers in their white coats were about to ruin it with a bunch of government-mandated junk. You can just imagine the focus groups. A young engineer, flush with pride over his new computational fluid dynamics (CFD) model, showing how a sloped hood and a one-piece curved windshield could save 8% on fuel. And across the table, a 30-year veteran trucker, arms crossed, coffee in hand, just shaking his head. "If I can't see the bird on the end of my hood," he might say, "it ain't a Peterbilt." It was a joke among engineers that the marketing department should have just put a picture of a 379 on the wall and said, "Build that, but make it legal and efficient. Good luck." They couldn't just modify the 379. They tried. Bolting on the new DPF systems to the 379's 1980s frame was a nightmare. The new cooling packages simply wouldn't fit without cartoonishly mangling the hood. They had to start over, but they had to do it in secret, and they had to make the new look like the old. The project was a masterclass in compromise. The first thing they had to fix was the cab. The 379's cab, while an improvement on the 359, was still an old design. The engineers developed an entirely new, stronger and more modern aluminum cab structure. This new cab would be stronger, quieter, and most importantly, designed from the ground up to house modern electronics, a new dash, and better ergonomics. Then they attacked the aerodynamics, but with kid gloves. They knew they couldn't slope the hood. That was heresy. So they made it longer. By stretching the hood, they could fit the massive new cooling package and maintain the classic proportions. They took the 379's external air cleaners and, in a brilliant move, integrated them into the side of the hood cowling, smoothing the airflow. They kept the flat two-piece windshield, a massive concession to the traditionalists. But the biggest, most controversial change was the headlights. The 379 had its headlights mounted on the fender in distinct pods, or buckets, a design that dated back to the 1930s. It was classic, but it was also aerodynamically terrible. The engineers made the bold choice to move to a single-piece, aerodynamic headlamp assembly that was integrated into the fender itself. This one change would become the new truck's most obvious and divisive visual cue. They were building a truck that was, in every meaningful way, brand new. New cab, new chassis, new cooling system, new electronics, new hood. But they were styling it to be the ghost of the 379. It was a replacement that was also an homage. They were passing the torch, but they polished the handle first. As 2007 loomed, the Denton factory prepared for the changeover. The final 379s rolled off the line. Peterbilt, knowing the significance, created a special Legacy Class edition to mark the end of the 20-year run. Drivers scrambled to buy them, paying huge markups to get one of the last real Peterbilts. It was a somber, uncertain time. The king was dead, and now the world was about to meet the new prince, a truck born of regulation and compromise, and everyone was holding their breath to see if the crown still fit. So in 2007, as the last of the Legacy Class 379s were being reverently driven off dealer lots, The replacement arrived. It was the Peterbilt 389, and the trucking world collectively squinted at it and said, "Huh." It was a strange moment. The 389 was so similar, yet so different. It was like seeing your best friend after they'd been to Hollywood and had some work done. The long hood was still there, in fact, it was longer than ever. This was the key technical detail of the launch. The new hood measured 131 inches from the bumper to the back of the cab. This made the 389 the longest hood conventional Peterbilt had ever put into production. This wasn't just a marketing gimmick, it was an engineering necessity. As we discussed, that massive, the 1000-degree DPF and the hotter running EGR engine required a colossal cooling package. The 131-inch hood was the only way to shroud that new, larger radiator while maintaining the classic muscular proportions. But the drivers, their eyes weren't on the hood's length. They were all staring, with a mixture of confusion and betrayal, at the headlights. This was the flashpoint. The 379 had its classic fender-mounted pods, separate, round, and timeless. The 389, in the name of aerodynamics and modernisation, had them integrated. It featured a one-piece, automotive-style headlamp assembly, swept back into the curve of a newly sculpted fender. The human element of this launch was the sheer visceral rejection of those headlights. The online trucking forums lit up. The truck stop counters buzzed. "They look like they're off a minivan," was a common disgusted refrain. "That's not a Peterbilt," others declared. The old guard was heartbroken. To them, those pod-mounted lights were part of the truck's soul. They were simple, they were rugged, they were cheap to replace. This new, fancy, all-in-one unit. It was a symbol of everything they feared. Complex, fragile, and, as one driver put it, probably costs $1,000 if a rock hits it. To be fair, he wasn't far off, and it was a bitter pill to swallow for a guy used to replacing a sealed beam for $20 and some pocket change. Peterbilt, however, was playing the long game. They knew that while the eyes were on the headlights, the driver's body was in the cab, and the cab was where they'd laid their real trap. The 389 debuted with Peterbilt's brand new aluminum cab structure. It was stronger, stiffer, and most importantly, quieter. The doors had triple seals, shutting with a satisfying thunk that sealed out the wind noise that 379 drivers had simply learned to live with. And then there was the dash. This was the second major change, and it was just as profound. Gone was the 379's iconic flat panel, a vast wide-open plane of analogue gauges. In its place was a modern, ergonomic wraparound cockpit. It was beautiful, trimmed in brushed aluminum and optional burl wood, and it was undeniably more user-friendly. The most used. Switches were moved closer to the driver's right hand. The ergonomics were, for the first time, a primary design consideration, not an afterthought. But right in the centre, gleaming back at the driver, was a new digital information screen. This, almost as much as the headlights, was a source of suspicion. It displayed all the new, necessary information: average fuel economy, trip time, and, most critically, information about the new emission system. It would tell you when the DPF was regenerating, or, in the worst-case scenario, flash a fault code. This was a paradigm shift. The 379 driver listened to their truck. They knew the pitch of the turbo, the feel of the mechanical engine. The 389 driver read their truck. An old-timer might grumble, "I don't need a screen to tell me my MPG. My right foot tells me my MPG." It was the digital age arriving, whether they liked it or not. The key historical fact of this transition is that Peterbilt balanced this new tech with its core identity. While the dash was new, it was filled with traditional chrome-bezeled needle and dial gauges. There was no all-digital dash. Peterbilt knew its customers. They gave them the new digital screen because the law required it, but they surrounded it with the analogue eye candy they craved. It was a brilliant compromise, and Peterbilt continued its custom-built philosophy. The 389 wasn't a one-size-fits-all truck. You could still order it your way. You wanted the 13-speed or the 18-speed Eaton Fuller? Done. You wanted a specific Cummins or Cat engine? Done. And the paint? The paint jobs were still legendary. The new sweeping fenders and the integrated headlights, once drivers got over the shock, actually provided a new, cleaner canvas for the intricate pinstripes and multi-tone fades that Peterbilt was famous for. The sleeper was another major selling point. The Unibilt system was refined, and the platinum interior package set a new standard. It featured leather, high-back air-ride seats, premium sound systems, and enough storage to lose a small pet in. It was a rolling luxury condo. The sales pitch was subtle. We know the new engine is complicated. We know you miss the old headlights. But how about you spend your 10-hour break in a cab that's quieter than a library and more comfortable than your recliner at home? It was a slow, reluctant adoption. For the first few years, the 389 was the new truck nobody was sure about. The new 07 emission systems across all truck brands were notoriously buggy. DPFs clogged, sensors failed, and drivers were constantly being forced into parked regions on the side of the road. They blamed the truck, the 389, for the sins of the engine. Pre-2007, pre-emission 379s were a white-hot commodity. Used ones with 500,000 miles were often selling for more than brand new 389s, as owner-operators desperately tried to avoid the new, unproven DPF systems. But time and engineering marched on. The engine makers sorted out the bugs. The DPFs became more reliable, and a new generation of drivers, ones who hadn't spent 20 years in a 379, started their careers in a 389. To them, the integrated headlights weren't a betrayal. They were just headlights. They appreciated the quiet cab and the comfortable ride, and as the custom truck scene got its hands on the 3089, they proved the old guard wrong. They painted the headlight bezels, added chrome visors, and created rigs that were every bit as stunning and arguably more aggressive than the 379s they replaced. The king was gone, but the 389, after a rocky start, was finally settling onto the throne. That 131-inch hood wasn't just a styling exercise, it was a necessity. It was a massive aluminum throne room for the new generation of engines that were being forced to run hotter and cleaner than ever before. The heart of the highway was changing, and the 389 was built to house it. When the 389 launched in 2007, the engine options were familiar, a greatest hits collection for the owner-operator. Under that long hood, you could specify the big displacement kings. You could get the legendary Caterpillar C15, that massive block of cat yellow power, famous for its incredible low-end torque. You could also get the Cummins ISX, the big red engine, renowned for its reliability and its signature, sharp-edged bark from its Jake brake. For a while, the 389 was simply the new, more comfortable home for these beloved time-tested power plants. And this is where we find a powerful human element, the brand loyalty. In the world of trucking, your engine choice was a statement of identity. It was a tribal affiliation. You weren't just a trucker, you were a Cat guy or a Cummins guy. The arguments at the fuel island were endless and passionate, half serious and half religious. Cat drivers, wiping a grease-stained hand on a yellow rag, would talk about grunt, about how their C15 could pull a mountain down without breaking a sweat, and how it just sounded meaner. Cummins drivers, in turn, would praise their ISX's longevity, its simpler design, for a time, and its better fuel economy. It was a rivalry as old as the highway itself, and asking a driver, Cat or Cummins, was often a more loaded question than asking about politics or religion. Then, almost immediately after the 389's launch, a bombshell dropped. A key historical fact that shook the industry to its core. In 2008, Caterpillar announced it was leaving the on-highway truck engine business. The new 2010 emissions standards, which would require even more complex aftertreatment, specifically selective catalytic reduction, or SCR, were the final straw. Cat decided the research and development costs were just too high for a market they no longer dominated. The Cat guys were devastated. It was an end of an era. The legendary million-mile motor was gone. For a brief period, this left a massive power vacuum, and Cummins, with its updated ESX15, became the dominant and often only high-horsepower engine of choice for owner-operators spec'ing a new 389. But PACCAR, Peterbilt's parent company, had been playing chess, not checkers. They had seen this coming. They were tired of being reliant on third-party suppliers for the most important component of their trucks. They didn't just want to build the truck, they wanted to build the heart. Enter the PACCAR MX-13. This engine was PACCAR's big play. It wasn't built from scratch. It was based on a highly successful and proven 12.9-litre engine from DAF, their European truck brand. But it was heavily re-engineered for the brutal demands of the North American market. The MX-13 was, from its very inception, designed to work with the new emission systems, not around them. Where the C15 and ISX were old-school designs retrofitted with DPFs and EGR, the MX-13 was a fully integrated modern package. It was made of lightweight, high-strength compacted graphite iron. It had an overhead cam, a rear-mounted gear train, and integrated wiring and fuel systems. It was incredibly quiet. It was, in a word, smart. And at first, many traditional owner-operators hated it. It was only 13 litres. American truckers, raised on the 15-litre displacement of the Cat and Cummins, lived by the motto, "There's no replacement for displacement." They looked at the MX-13 with deep suspicion. It was European. It was too quiet. It didn't have the raw, mechanical grunt they were used to, but fleets loved it. It was lighter, it was more fuel efficient, and it offered something new, the proprietary powertrain. PACCAR could now offer a truck where the PACCAR engine, the PACCAR transmission, and PACCAR axles were all designed to communicate with each other, optimizing performance and efficiency. But for the true owner-operator, the 389's soul was still defined by the gear shifter, and the king of shifters was the one, the only, the Eaton Fuller 18-speed manual. This transmission is a beautiful technical detail, a complex mechanical dance that defines the art of driving. For the uninitiated, it looks like a simple 4/4 H pattern. But on the driver's left hand, there are two air-actuated switches, a red or grey range selector for low and high range, and a silver or black splitter for high and low gear in each slot. To run through the gears, a driver would start in low range. First, low split, flick the splitter, first, high split, second, low split, flick, second, high split, and so on. Then, after shifting into fourth, high split, they'd pre-select the range lever, move the stick back to the first gear position, and it would magically become fifth, low split. It was a rhythmic, satisfying process. Experienced drivers almost never used the clutch except to start and stop, a technique called floating gears. They would match the engine RPM to the road speed by ear and by feel, sliding the stick out of gear, letting the RPMs drop just right, and then sliding it into the next gear with nothing but a subtle click. And connected to that engine was the Jake brake. The Jacobs engine brake is not a brake at all in the conventional sense. It's a compression release brake. When the driver flips the switch, the engine's exhaust valves are opened at the very top of the compression stroke, releasing all that compressed air. This turns the engine, with all 15 litres of its displacement, into a giant power-absorbing air compressor. The resulting sound is the anthem of the highway, a deep, staccato, thunderous brap, 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 brap that echoes off mountainsides and under overpasses, a sound that has probably saved more brake pads than any other invention in trucking history. The heart of the 389 was, therefore, a story of transition. It began as the last great haul for the old gods of diesel, Cat and Cummins. It weathered the departure of a legend, and it became the cradle for PACCAR's own high-tech, efficient future with the MX-13. It was the place where the raw, tactile skill of mastering an 18-speed manual met the digital efficiency of the new automated transmissions. It was, and is, the very heart of the modern American highway. The rumble of a big-bore diesel is the truck's heart, that 18-speed shifter its mechanical mind. But the heart and mind are only part of the story. For the long-haul driver, the real truck, the part that truly matters at the end of a 700-mile day, is the 10-foot space directly behind the driver's seat. It's the cab, and more importantly, the sleeper. It is their kitchen, their bedroom, their living room, and their sanctuary. And with the 389, Peterbilt didn't just build a sleeper, they crafted a first-class ticket. When the 389 launched, Peterbilt understood that while the chrome and the long hood sold the truck's image, the interior sold the truck's livability. This was the era of the platinum interior. Stepping up from the cab of a 379 into a 389 was less a step and more an upgrade. The new cab we discussed, with its all-aluminum construction and triple-sealed doors, created a foundation of quiet. It was a rattle-free, draft-free, solid-feeling vault, and inside this vault the designers went to work. The platinum trim was a statement. Gone was the sea of hard, industrial-grade plastic. In its place were soft-touch materials, rich burl wood grain panels on the dash and doors, and brushed aluminum trim that surrounded the gauges. It was automotive grade, a level of fit and finish that the heavy-duty market had rarely seen. The driver wasn't just sitting in a rig, they were piloting a luxury machine. The throne itself was a masterpiece. The standard air ride seats were good, but the optional Peterbilt LX or ST captain's chairs, wrapped in two-tone leather, were sublime. They were heated, sometimes even cooled, with adjustable lumbar supports, armrests. They were ergonomically designed to fight the fatigue of a 10-hour drive. This was crucial. A driver who wasn't in pain was a driver who was safer, happier, and more alert. And then there was the sleeper, the home on the road. The core technical detail was the refinement of the Unibilt cab sleeper system. This system, which Peterbilt had pioneered, meant the cab and sleeper were one single, integrated aluminum shell. There was no boot, that leaky, noisy, accordion-like rubber tunnel that connected the cab to a separate sleeper box. The Unibilt design was watertight. It was incredibly quiet, and it allowed for a wide open walkthrough. A driver could stand up, turn around, and walk straight from the wheel into their living quarters without bending in half. Peterbilt offered a range of sleeper sizes, from a 44-inch day-and-a-half sleeper to the 58-inch, but the kings of the road were the 72-inch and 78-inch high-roof models. These weren't bunks. They were rolling studio apartments. Inside one of these platinum sleepers, the sheer volume of space was, and still is, astounding. There was room for a full-size 8-inch thick mattress. The walls were lined with carpet, the lighting was soft, and the storage was everywhere. Overhead cabinets, a full-height wardrobe closet for hanging, clothes, deep cabinets for food, and massive cavernous storage bays under the bunk, accessible from both inside and outside. This human element, the sheer livability, is what set the 389 apart. Imagine a driver pulled into a truck stop in Cheyenne, Wyoming, a 34-hour restart. Outside, a blizzard is raging, the wind is howling at 50 miles an hour, and the temperature is dropping into the single digits. In an older truck, that driver would be in a cramped coffin bunk, fighting the drafts, the engine idling all night just for warmth, the noise of the neighbouring reefer unit vibrating through the thin walls. But the 389 driver, they're at home. They've shut down the main engine, and their quiet, efficient auxiliary power unit, or APU, is humming, providing heat and electricity. They're in their socks, on a soft carpet. They walk to their factory-installed refrigerator, pull out a cold drink, and put a meal in their microwave, which sits on a dedicated factory-prepped shelf. After dinner, they swivel the passenger seat to face the back, prop their feet up, and watch a movie on a flat-screen TV, mounted to a reinforced bracket built for this exact purpose. This isn't just comfort, it's dignity. It's a recognition that the person doing one of the hardest jobs in the world deserves to live like a human being. And this brings us to a key historical fact of the 389's era, the driver retention crisis. By the mid-2000s, the trucking industry was bleeding drivers. Annual turnover at large fleets often exceeded 90%. Experienced drivers were retiring, and not enough new ones were coming in. Fleets and owner-operators were desperate to keep their best people. Suddenly, driver comfort wasn't a luxury item, it was a core business strategy. The Peterbilt 389 Platinum became a tool of retention. Fleets began creating reward trucks for their top-performing, million-mile accident-free drivers. And the reward, the truck everyone wanted, was a new, fully loaded 389. Giving a driver the keys to a Platinum spec 389 was more than just giving them new equipment. It was a sign of respect. It was a tangible burlwood and leather-trimmed thank you. It told the driver, "We value you, and we want you to be comfortable." This investment in comfort paid for itself time and time again by keeping a good driver in the seat. The 389's interior was the ultimate expression of Peterbilt's class mantra. It was the perfect, quiet, luxurious sanctuary on the inside that balanced the bold, powerful, and iconic statement being made on the outside. It was a home, built to move at 70 miles an hour. And while the driver was resting in this first-class cabin, their eyes would inevitably drift to the world outside, to the chrome and polished aluminum that made their 389 theirs. That platinum interior was a sanctuary, a quiet, comfortable space that Peterbilt built for the driver. But the outside of the truck, that was the driver's. That was their statement to the world. And no truck in history has provided a better canvas for that statement than the Peterbilt 389. It was, and is, the undisputed king of the chrome. From its earliest days in the 1930s, Peterbilt's philosophy was custom built. But the 389 took that idea out of the factory and handed it to the owner-operator. It was a perfect storm of classic design and modern proportions. The long 131-inch hood, the flat top or high roof sleeper options, the sweeping fenders. It was a 32 Ford highboy coupe for the working man. It had the bones, the lines, the attitude. All it needed was an artist. And this is the human element, the very soul of the 389 story, the driver as an artist. To the outside world, a truck is just a truck. It's a tool to move freight. But to the owner-operator who just spent $170,000 of their own money on a 389, it is an extension of their identity. It's their business card, their home, and their pride, all polished and rolling on 18 wheels. This pride fueled a vibrant multi-million-dollar subculture. It wasn't enough to just own a 389, you had to make it yours. This culture is most visible at the major truck shows, like the Mid-America Trucking Show, MATS, in Louisville, or the Great American Trucking Show, GATS, in Dallas. Here, in brightly lit convention halls, drivers would line up their rigs for the show and shine. These trucks weren't just clean, they were surgically clean. Drivers would spend days polishing every single bolt head, using Q-tips to clean the dust from between the grill bars. The competition was and is fierce. But the camaraderie is stronger. Drivers walk the rows, not with jealousy, but with deep respect, pointing out a clever custom light bracket or a perfect paint fade. They'd swap tips on polishing compounds, who did their interior, or where they got that massive 20-inch drop visor that sits so low it looks like the truck is peering out from under a ball cap. The key historical fact of this era is the explosion of the 389-focused aftermarket industry. Companies like Iowa 80, the world's largest truck stop, became meccas. Their catalogues were like the old Sears and Roebuck catalogue, but filled with nothing but stainless steel. Entire businesses were founded just to build custom parts specifically for the 389. You didn't just buy a part. You'd call a fabricator and say, "I want a set of 8-inch bull hauler stacks, but with a custom-cut Aussie-style tip," and they'd make it. So, what exactly gets customized? The better question is, what doesn't? This is the technical detail, the anatomy of a custom 389. It starts with the stance. Many drivers would lower the front axle, giving the truck an aggressive, raked look. Then they'd stretch the frame. A factory wheelbase of 280 inches was long, but custom shops would cut the frame in half, add new rails, and stretch it to 300, 320, or even 340 inches. This did absolutely nothing for practicality. It made the turning radius of an ocean liner, but it looked incredible. It was the trucking equivalent of a long flowing cape. Then comes the light, the chicken lights. The 389 became a rolling canvas for the new bright and reliable LED. Drivers would add hundreds of them. Amber lights under the cab, along the bottom of the sleeper, down the back of the air cleaners. Red lights lining the rear fenders and frame. Some drivers had so many lights, it was a running joke that when they hit the all-on switch, the truck's alternator would let out a small sob, and a nearby town would experience a momentary brownout. At night, a fully lit custom 389 rolling down a dark highway didn't look like a truck at all. It looked like a low-flying spaceship, a UFO of chrome and amber, and that chrome, oh, the chrome. A custom 389 was a study in stainless steel. The front, a massive 22-inch mirror-polished bumper, a custom grille, maybe a punch hole or vertical bar style. The all-important stainless drop visor shading the windshield. The side, polished battery box covers. Fuel tanks shined to a mirror finish with stainless steel straps. Bunk heaters, those louvered chrome panels that went under the sleeper. Even the window, chops, pieces of chrome that made the side windows look shorter and more aggressive. The stacks. This was the truck's voice. The factory exhaust was replaced with towering 8-inch or even 10-inch diameter bull hauler stacks, straight pipes that let the Cat or Cummins engine sing its unfiltered, thunderous song. The rear. A custom-welded deck plate between the frame rails, often punched with intricate designs and backlit with red LEDs. Custom light bars holding dozens of red lights. Polished stainless steel half fenders arcing perfectly over the drive tyres. Even the platinum interior wasn't safe. Drivers would pull out the factory carpet and install hardwood floors. They'd have the dash panels taken out and custom painted to match the exterior. The steering wheel would be replaced with a custom 4-spoke model. Why do all this? Why spend an extra $100,000 on a working tool? For the same reason a peacock has feathers. It's a declaration. In an industry that increasingly tries to turn drivers into replaceable steering wheel holders, a custom 389 was a loud £80,000 protest. It said, "I am not a number. I am a professional. I am an artist, and this is my masterpiece." This deep personal and financial investment in the 389 as an identity is what made the news so hard to take. The truck was more than a model. It was the standard bearer for an entire way of life. And just as the custom culture was reaching its absolute peak, the engineers at PACCAR once again had to deliver the bad news. The party, it seemed, was coming to an end. The custom culture was the 389's golden age, a rolling renaissance of chrome and light. For over a decade, the truck was not just a part of the landscape, it was the landscape. It was the undisputed, unchallenged king. But on the engineering floors in Denton, the calendars were flipping and the memos were coming down from PACCAR. The world was changing yet again. History, as they say, doesn't repeat, but it certainly does rhyme. The same forces that had retired the 359, the same regulatory pressure that had sunset the 379, were now taking aim at the 389. The enemy this time wasn't just particulate matter or NOx, it was a more invisible, more fundamental target: carbon dioxide or CO2. The key historical fact was the new, far stricter Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, Greenhouse Gas, GHG, Phase 2 standards. These rules were designed to aggressively improve fuel economy across entire truck fleets. And the Peterbilt 389, for all its glory, was an aerodynamic disaster. That flat two-piece windshield which drivers had demanded was a wall of wind. The classic long square hood, while majestic, was a box. The 389 was, in essence, a beautifully crafted 18-wheeled brick. In an era of 5-a-gallon diesel, and with government mandates demanding 25% or more in fuel savings, the 389's days were numbered. The rumours started as a whisper at the truck shows, then grew to a roar on the online forums. "They're going to kill the 389, one post would read, followed by dozens of replies of denial and anger. "They can't. I'll never buy another truck." But in 2023, as PACCAR made the official heartbreaking announcement, the Peterbilt 389 would be discontinued, with production ceasing in 2024. A new truck, the Model 589, would take its place. The reaction from the trucking community was immediate, visceral and predictable. It was a collective cry of "not again." It was a death in the family. The 389 wasn't just a truck, it was the last real truck, the last bastion of the classic long hood style. And this human element, the nostalgic panic, created a market frenzy. Just as had happened with the 379, the demand for the last of the 389s exploded. Fleet owners and owner-operators who had been on the fence about a new truck suddenly stampeded their dealers. The order boards at Peterbilt filled up instantly. People weren't just buying a truck, they were buying a collector's item, an end-of-an-era time capsule. They were placing orders for trucks that wouldn't be built for a year, paying massive markups, all for one last chance to own the legend. The value of used 389s, especially the highly coveted pre-DPF models from 2007, shot into the stratosphere. Peterbilt, to their immense credit, understood the gravity of this moment. They knew their customers. They knew this couldn't be a quiet fading away. The 389 deserved, and its drivers demanded, a hero's send-off. So, they planned a long, celebratory farewell, punctuated by special editions that would become the crown jewels of the 389's reign. First, there was the 389X. This wasn't a single, final model, but an exclusive limited edition package offered in the final years. The 389X is a perfect technical detail, as it was essentially Peterbilt's factory-built nod to the custom culture. It was the show and shine truck straight from the assembly line. The 389X package was a love letter to chrome. It started with a unique retro-style louvered grille. The hood was adorned with a polished hood spine, a feature that recalled the classic 359. It featured massive 7-inch bull hauler stacks, factory installed. The air cleaners were wrapped in chrome, the fenders were polished, and the exterior was lit up like a Christmas tree with a special package of 389X branded LED lights. The interior was just as special, a platinum-level cab with exclusive wood grain trim, embroidered X logos on the leather seats, and a special plaque. The 389X was for the driver who wanted that custom, king of the chrome look, but with the fit, finish, and warranty of a factory build. And then, as the final days approached, Peterbilt announced the grand finale. The final 1000. This was it. The last of the line. Peterbilt announced that the final 1,000 389s to ever roll off the Denton assembly line would be special, serialized models. This human element, the scramble for an allocation, was chaos. Only 1,000 would ever be made. Getting one wasn't just a matter of money, it was about loyalty. Long-time Peterbilt customers, fleets that had bought hundreds of trucks, legendary owner-operators. They were all calling their dealers, calling in favours, trying to secure a build slot. A final 1,000 allocation was a winning lottery ticket. What made them special? It was all in the details. Each of the final 1,000 trucks wore a special bright finish emblem on the side of the hood. But the real prize was inside. On the dash, in that burl wood grain, was a custom-engraved serialized plaque. It read Final 1,000 and displayed the truck's unique number from 01 to 1,000. It was a certificate of authenticity, a permanent mark that this was one of the very last. These trucks also received other heritage-celebrating touches. They featured the classic Peterbilt script logo on the side of the hood, a direct nod to the company's 1939 origins. The interior featured the Final 1000 logo stitched into the headrests. These were, by default, the most optioned, most luxurious, and most desirable 399s ever produced. Imagine the scene at the Denton plant. Every worker on that line knew what they were building. They weren't just bolting on a fender, they were signing their name to history. When truck number 1000 of 1000 finally rolled off the line in 2024, it was the end of a 16-year dynasty. The 389, born from the regulations of 2007, was being retired by the regulations of 2024. The long farewell was over. The king was once again dead, and the entire trucking world, holding its breath, turned its eyes to the successor, the new Model 589, and asked the impossible question, what now? The Denton plant didn't stay dark for long. The end of one production run simply marked the beginning of another. As the echoes of the final 1000 faded, the first of the new generation rolled into the lights. It was the Peterbilt 589. And the world, which had just finished its grieving, looked on with a critical, cautious eye. If the 389 was the prince forced to replace the legendary 379, the 589 was the heir apparent, born and bred for a crown it had to wear. Peterbilt's engineers had faced this impossible task twice before, and by now they had learned some very hard lessons. The first lesson was that heritage wasn't just a styling cue, it was the entire brand. So, at first glance, the 589 looked familiar. It had the long 131-inch hood option. It had the bold, squared-off grille. It had the dual external air cleaners. And, in a move that made the 359 and 379 purists weep with vindicated joy, the 589 brought back the pod-mounted headlights. After all the fury the 389's integrated lights had caused in 2007, Peterbilt had, in a way, admitted the traditionalists were right. The 589's headlights were classic, round, and sat on the fender just as they had a generation prior. It was a clear, unambiguous statement. We hear you, we remember. But the 589 was not a 389. It was a brilliant, necessary illusion. It was a truck designed by aerodynamicists, cleverly disguised as a truck designed by traditionalists. The key historical fact is that the 589 is the child of the EPA's GHG Phase 2 rules. It had to be more fuel efficient, and that's where the compromises, the truly massive changes, were hidden in plain sight. The single most significant technical detail, the one that broke a 50-year-old tradition, was the windshield. The 359 had flat glass, the 370 had flat glass, the 389 had flat glass. The 589 has a one-piece, gently curved, steeply raked windshield. To the owner-operator, this was heresy. It was the minivan comment all over again, but to the engineers, it was a non-negotiable aerodynamic victory. That subtle curve helps the wind flow over the cab, not into it. The other changes followed suit. The new cab is 1.8 meters wider, giving the driver more space. The visor, the fenders, the mirror cowls. Every single component was put through a wind tunnel, and its shape was subtly slippered to cheat the wind, to eke out another tenth of a mile per gallon. Inside, the transition to the digital age was complete. Gone was the 389's compromise dash. The 589 features a stunning 15-inch fully digital display. It's configurable, it's high definition, and it provides the driver with more data than a 1980s mission control. And so we see the human element, the mixed, reluctant reception. The 389 loyalist, arms crossed, stands at the truck stop, walking a slow circle around the new 589. They hate the curved windshield. They're deeply suspicious of the video game dash. They'll mumble, "It's just not the same," but then they'll see the pod headlights, they'll see the long hood, they'll see the 7-inch stacks, and they'll grudgingly admit, well, at least they tried. At least it's not one of those anteaters, a popular and uncharitable term for the sloped hood aerodynamic trucks. The 589 is the future. It's the truck that will carry the PACCAR nameplate and the owner-operator's pride into the next decade. But what then is the 389's final legacy? The 389 was quite simply the last of its kind. It was the bridge. It was the last truck to wear the two-piece flat glass. It was the truck that carried the weight of the new, painful emissions technology, bearing the brunt of all those early DPF and EGR failures, so that its successors could run clean. It was the last great canvas for the analog artist in a digital world. It was the truck that managed to be, all at once, a product of 1980s styling, 1960s heritage, and 2010s technology. It was imperfect. It was thirsty. It was aerodynamically a bold protest against the laws of physics, but it was beautiful, and it was honest. In an industry that demands conformity, the 389 was the ultimate symbol of individuality. It was the king of the chrome, the legacy class, the final 1000. It was the truck that every driver wanted to own, and the truck that every other truck wanted to be. The 589 will have its own story. It will be customized. It will be loved, but it will always live in the shadow of the giant that came before it. The 389's place in history is secure as the definitive, quintessential, and perhaps the very last pure-blooded American long hood icon. And now the rumble of that big red Cummins or that yellow cat begins to fade into the background. The journey is ending. The story of the 389, a story of steel and pride, of logger's grit and trucker's art, is now complete. The lights of the Denton plant are behind us, and all we see ahead is the long, dark ribbon of highway, stretching out into the quiet of the continent. The endless rows of amber chicken lights on that custom sleeper begin to blur, just a warm golden streak against the cool, dark asphalt. The sound of the Jake brake echoing off a distant overpass is just a memory now, a deep and rhythmic lullaby. The wheels will keep turning, of course. The 589s and the trucks that come after them will continue to haul the country. But the 389, it has earned its rest. It has become more than a machine. It's a benchmark. It is a rolling monument to an era, a time when a truck was not just a tool, but a declaration of independence, polished and shining, one long, magnificent hood at a time. So, settle in. Let the hum of the tyres on the pavement be your guide. Let the road hold you. The story is told and the miles ahead are clear.